Baltimore City Council. I welcome you to the council chambers. We are here this morning to conduct our 28th work session on City Council Bill 12-0152, Transform Baltimore Zoning. During our 27th work session held on Wednesday, April the 8th, we worked on Appendix A tables on pages 13 through 19. Today, we will begin our review of the tables by completing page 19 of Appendix A and work on as much as we can during today's session in 2 hours. I encourage everyone to visit the City Council's website, www.baltimorecitycouncil.com, to stay updated on the section of the bill the Land Use and Transportation Committee is working on at each work session. If you are unable to attend the scheduled work session and you wish to provide written comments and/or amendments, please mail it to the Office of Council Services. Attention to Jennifer Coates, who's to my right, at 100 North Holiday Street, Baltimore, Maryland, 21202, or email Jennifer at jennifer.coates@baltimorecity.gov. The one and only ground rule I have is please turn off your cell phones, smartphones, Androids, to give respect and courtesy to those who are going to testify. Let me make sure I did that because last time I left mine on. Okay. We are, to introduce some of my colleagues, we have to my far left Councilman Bill Henry. To Councilman Henry's right is Councilwoman Ricky Spector.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
To my second left is Councilwoman Mary Pat Clark. To my immediate left is Councilman Jim Kraft, who is the Vice Chair of the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We are also joined by in the audience, Angela Gibson, who is representing Mayor Stephanie Rollins Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
We're also joined by Kara Kuntz, to my far right, representing the President of the City Council, Jack Young. Also, we have sitting in front of me is with the projector is Mr. Paul Plymouth, representing the President of the City Council, Jack Young. We're also joined by the committee's attorney, representing the Land Use and Transportation Committee, Mr. John Willis. And to my immediate right is Miss Jennifer Coates, staff person to the committee. We are now on page 19, and I just want to I say this at every work session. This here is a work session. It's not a public hearing. So anyone who has any questions that's related to the section that we're working on at that time can ask a question. If you have an amendment, you can present the amendment to Jennifer Coates or Kara Kuntz, and we will not be going back. We don't go back to past titles. You know, we're going forward. So. At this time, we are on page 19, table 11-301, permitted and conditional uses in the industrial zoning district. That's where we left off. And I'm going to turn it over to Laurie. I think you were supposed to give us, Ms. Feinberg, regards to the wireless report on the...
Yeah, planning and law are still working on that. We do not have that. Again, it will be for, upon completion. It affects all the tables because it's related to updates on federal law, so it will not be unique to this section.
Okay.
And there's also some text language, too, that has to be updated, which I think Mr. Turvola started to give the committee, but we'll wanted to do that comprehensively.
Well, when you have that, you can just forward it to the staff.
We will.
Okay. Thank you. So does anyone have any amendments? Any of my colleagues have any amendments or questions on page 19?
No, Mr. Chairman, we did delete planned unit development. I thought that we all had consensus on that from the categories entirely at our last meeting.
Yes, we were comfortable with the deletion of planned unit development really from all the tables because it already is its own
Right.
ordinance and it really does not need to be reflected in the use tables. And we would just want that to be consistent across the board.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now we are on page 20.
Well, I do have a comment on page 20. I don't have amendments, but I have a discussion, I have a comment on 20.
Go ahead. Make sure you use the microphone.
Mr. Chairman, I'm now involved in a conversation that is very important, certainly to my district, about IMUs and these bulk regulations. Basically, I've always been thinking about this as renovation of old warehouses. But, Ms. Floyd is here and can talk for herself much better than I can, but her point is that this also applies to a piece of land. In other words, you could tear down the old warehouse and you could build a new piece of property in an IMU, and you would only need 300 square feet per dwelling unit. In other words, you could build a pretty residentially intensive place. So that's a whole different perspective that I've never focused on before, and it concerns me. And Ms. Floyd can speak better to it, but what I'm concerned about is the residential component and size of the proposed dwelling units in the use table, which I know we can't go back to now, but we can certainly look at this table. And it's too small. It's too intense in its possibilities for development. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilman Kraft?
The other question, and I had a note from our notes from back in October when we dealt with this, and it was one of those things we said we'd deal with when we got to the table, but it was also the comparing the reuse versus the new construction, dealing with where we were going to, how we distinguish between rehabilitation, reuse, historic preservation of sites, which we're doing a lot of along the waterfront, and then new construction where we're clearing a site, and how we distinguish between the two of those. So if we can address them also.
Yes, it's very intentional that the 300 square foot density is for the IMU. There's also height limits. It's very similar in density and height limits to the commercial, the neighborhood-based commercial corridors, not the downtown corridors, as they're sort of on the edges of the streets. We certainly would be open to breaking it into two categories if the council prefers, so that new construction is treated differently than the reuse of an existing building. There are some areas where most of the IMU areas, the buildings have character that we would hope to see reused. They're not maybe preservation level, but have character. But there are areas that were recommended IMU mapping that the former industrial buildings really don't have much character. They're metal sheds, and we certainly wouldn't want to, limit those, to reuse. But again, the unifying characteristic of the IMU is the way we mapped it is existing areas that are in transition on edges and are not ideally suited for traditional industry. Those are the main principles, and you recall Jill Lemke spoke about that at the last work session. So those main principles are that, part of the reason they're not suited for modern industry is, they're not good for trucks, that, the locations aren't right for heavy trucks or those sorts of things. Otherwise, we would have recommended a heavier industrial zone. These are transitional areas. If the council would like to break it into two categories, again, the 300 square feet comes from looking at some of these traditional warehouse industrial buildings and trying to make sure you can actually use the space that exists. And a lot of them are very large, so you need some amount of residential density. But if there's a desire to break that, our suggestion would be to have two, like a subset, so that new construction's treated differently than reuse of an existing building.
Jim?
Okay, so you don't have an objection to splitting it into two different categories?
No, I think you would just split it in those. If you're treating the zone all the same except on one or two of the bulk requirements, such as density, you would just split that line in the table with a note that says, density for reuse, density for new construction. I don't think you need to create a whole new category because it's otherwise the same except for residential density. I think most folks agree that when you have these older buildings with character, you want to make sure you can use the space. If you look at things like the copycat building in Greenmount West or some of those other buildings, if you don't have some reasonable amount of density, you have empty space. And then no one will reuse the buildings. You'll have abandoned buildings is what you'll have.
Well, we had the conversation the other day about the buffer zones, right? And, I'm looking at my own map again. I'm looking at map 8C. And, I have an IMU, which is basically the Crown Cork and Seal site, which is, sits in the middle of industrial, I-2. It's got I-2 to the north, south, east, and west of it. And there's housing proposed in that development. I mean, there's residential right now in the pro formas that are being shown to the developers. There is housing in it. If I look at the IMU that's shown on Dillon Street.
Are you referring to the Crown Cork and Seal on Eastern Avenue, the one between?
Right, yeah, 8C.
8C.
Right, on Eastern Avenue. Eastern Avenue running along Lehigh back to Crescent Street.
Right.
Right, okay. So that Lehigh Street is still marked as an industrial corridor?
Correct.
Right, and the train track is to the northwest of it there. That's what that divider is, right? But that's all IMU, but you're going to be putting, in reality, there's housing going in there. mean, there's going to be housing going in there.
Housing has been proposed for that site, yes.
Right.
Some housing.
Yeah, but again, it's that whole issue we talked about the other day of pushing the housing right up against the industrial. That's not a buffer. I mean, all that does is exacerbate the problem. And I'm not saying don't
I
put the
understand.
housing there because the market
Right.
demands that the housing's
Right.
there. The problem is it, you know, and I'm looking at the IMU just to the west of that on Dillon Street, and that won't be IMU anyhow because that's all housing right now. That's already been turned into housing. Those are all townhouses, almost all of that. From Dean Street to Eaton Street down to Fagley Street, that's almost all. It's either townhouses or it's getting ready to be sold for townhouses. So, you know, I think we have to, although when the other day you said, you know, let's look at the maps, I don't quite know whether the intention is reflecting the reality.
Well,
if
I
that's
think-
the right way to describe it.
I think I understand your question, Councilman, and you know, this part of your district is very challenging because it is an intersection of multiple uses and purposes. You've got existing rail lines, you've got row houses that have existed for 100 years next to those rail lines, you've got small businesses, and you've got potentially a red line stopping right there. So it is a very unusual intersection, and we did struggle with this. We recommended the TOD zoning around the red line and the IMU around the Crown Cork and Seal. Again, I'm not sure that we have the perfect solution. I think this is as close.
Change it, that's all.
We'll work it out.
Well, I know that the developer would like this to be IMU. So I would encourage you to review their recent studies and, you know, and to discuss that with them. But they were the Southeast CDC testified here when we talked about Chapter 11 and IMU, and they've been working on this initiative. So I would just want to make sure that both the developer and the community group there, and they are working together.
Yeah, and I may be confused about that particular parcel, but I think they also mentioned something about whether TOD would be available for that parcel because there were some additional funds available if it were a TOD site.
And they own some of the TOD. I mean, the reality is it will be TOD in the sort of absolute sense. And we went back and forth and, you know, said, yes, it would qualify for the TOD zoning because it's close to the transit station, and it would qualify for the IMU zoning because of the nature of it and the buildings and the location. We were completely, you know, kind of split on that. And again, we would defer to that group that's been studying and comfortable with either.
Okay. All right, thank you.
We'll discuss this in a minute.
Well, may I say something? I mean, this is a problem because these IMUs are spread all over the place and are in different places. I don't want anything that's a 300 square foot dwelling unit added onto where the IMUs are placed in my district, which is mainly in Remington, because we already have a development going on, and they're part of it. We already have a development going on that's going to push the limits of our ability to accommodate in terms of traffic and all. I mean, it's a good development and all that kind of stuff, but I mean, one thing that, well, Joan can speak to this, Ms. Floyd can speak to this better than me, but the idea of a work-live space in an IMU, that's cool. But the idea of jamming a bunch of people into teeny apartments, no. And nobody ever talks about affordable. So we're even talking about tiny apartments that nobody can afford who lives there. I'm tired. I'm really, really tired in the district I'm honored to represent of seeing things jammed into spaces that are inadequate to accommodate them. And this would be an example of that. So I just want to get it fixed in a
Well,
way
yeah.
that everybody can live with, but that we can breathe in this neighborhood.
I think we're on the same page. Any other colleagues? No? Ms. Floyd?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just taking off on what the councilwoman said, she's speaking about a development that's on a 1-acre lot. And the number of apartments that are going there are 108. But this density is 145 units per acre. That's the density that is on this table. I'm going to go back and read one sentence to you from the comp plan. Again, last session, I referred to page 163. Mixed-use zones without residential. Business and industrial mixed-use zones are intended to be non-residential in order to protect the business and industrial users from residential conflict, as well as land speculation that would put undue pressure on business and industry through increasing the cost of land and being outcompeted for key properties. So that is the policy that you all adopted behind not having this be a residential district. So now what we have instead is a residential district that's 145 units per acre. And I'm not talking about a small apartment. I'm talking about a huge building filled with many apartments. 145 per acre. Very, very dense. And I also want to point out that the mapping has got this on places which are currently industrial that prohibit residential. So therefore, you're going from 0 residential to 145 units per acre. And that is, I'm aware of that because it is happening in my neighborhood. I'm sure it's happening other places as well. You're taking land that is currently not allowed to be used at all for industrial and turning it into, basically overnight, land that is 145 units per acre residential, is what I meant to say if I misspoke. 145 units per acre residential. I don't know of too many developers who would not want to take advantage of that, and you know, that's really attractive. So if the policy is one thing, and now you're here looking at the implementation of the policy, or not, actually. Now, the comment was made the other day that, well, when we looked at the IMU, we wanted people to be able to live over top of their, crafts people to live over top of their studios. And that is a different solution. But that's not the high-density residential multifamily. That's something completely different.
Yeah. Okay. Duly noted. I just want to say this, is that I know that there's been discussion about the city with the master plan, but it's my interpretation. This is a statement. It's not a question. I'm just a statement. Is that the master plan is really a blueprint, and it evolves. So it doesn't mean it's carved in stone. I mean, we did a master plan from Sharp Leadenhall, and it was an ordinance that came in, or resolution came in, and that's evolved to something completely different. So the master plan, as far as I'm concerned, is a blueprint, right, that can be changed. I mean, if I'm incorrect.
Correct. And I think there were some very important principles that were discussed as Ms. Floyd read in the master plan process. And as we worked through into the zoning code, the industrial chapter evolved based on those. There were some shifts in terms of where residential was permitted or limited or prohibited. But there were shifts in all the districts in terms of looking at the pure industrial as well, and the campus zones, the industrial campus, and that sort of thing. So yes, that process evolves, and the master plan notes that, previous or subsequent actions of the planning commission become part of that master plan. So that would be their action on the zoning code.
Okay.
We can, Mr. Chairman.
You want, Councilwoman, you used to.
If I may, I would ask the privilege of going back to this question even as we go forward, because I know our colleague has gone to get a backup document vis-à-vis the question of the master plan.
We can, I mean, it's a question. I'm open to that.
Okay, thank you.
So until he comes back,
Okay, so just hold so that we can.
well, I mean, yeah, if you,
Yeah,
CPHA?
yeah, Gregory Freeman, CPHA. I just wanted to note that in Philadelphia, which recently did a zoning code very similar to Baltimore's, form-based, mixed use, that whole thing, some similar concerns were actually raised about their version of industrial mixed use, which is a bit different than what Baltimore has. And what was proposed, and it was an amendment after the code was passed. I'm guessing the amendment was passed. I'm not sure. I can look it up. It was that there be a mandate that there be some non-residential uses in the IMUs, so that it wouldn't just be somebody going in, building up a whole bunch of luxury condos or knocking down a building. Because I'm not, I don't think that's what this that's what this category is necessarily intended for. Also, since the issue of affordability was brought up, and that's a huge concern for CPHA, when you increase the, part of the reason, I mean, there's a lot of issues with the housing market and the economics, and I confess I don't understand all of them. Part of it is when you have, really large minimum lot areas or, very large square foot regulations designed to decrease density, that in and of itself can increase the cost of housing. Another issue is, parking, which, someone's got to pay for it. And that's obviously going to be the person renting the home, even if they don't own a car. So I just bring that up since it was very briefly brought up. But it might be interested to see what they did in Philadelphia and see if that might address some of the density concerns.
Okay. What do you say?
We would be very open to looking at an amendment that set some minimum non-residential use in the IMU, because it certainly was not intended to take a building and make it residential exclusively. It is intended to be more of a live-work and studios and that sort of thing, and small businesses. So we'll work with that group and look at the Philadelphia proportions that they talked about as well.
What?
Nothing.
Jim went?
Jim went to get his charter.
Okay, all right.
To see the connection between the master plan and, I shouldn't speak for him. He went to get his charter. Charter.
Charter. Charter.
Yeah, his charter. We don't have a bookshelf in the room. All we have is rules of the city council in every desk. So, Mr. Chairman, if I may, I'd also like to, while we're on page 20, since we seem to still be there, mention that I would like to also do at least a split
They want a
around the
split?
height.
You say a split?
Yeah, I mean, I'm worried about the dwelling unit square footage for both new and rehab, but in terms of new construction or substantial reconstruction, I'm worried about the 60-foot maximum building height. And I think it's a little high. If it exists, you going into an existing IMU and you're rehabbing it, well, that's one thing. If it's 60 feet high, it's 60 feet high. If you're building something from scratch in an IMU district, though, 60 feet high is pretty high. In other words, you got a major thing going on there. And I think we should take a look at that before we just check it off as okay. I'm getting very height sensitive at this moment since I find myself with a 46-foot high bunch of 40 townhouses in Hoses Heights
Okay.
on top of a hill.
So you're not placing any amendments, you want it just the
I don't
committee
know
to
what to
discuss?
suggest.
Okay,
But
all right.
we need to do something about that also. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay, until he comes, Councilman Kraft comes back, we're on page, 20? We are now on page 21.
I have nothing.
Anyone on page 21, discuss on 21? No? Laurie?
No, not on 21, I'm sorry.
Okay, let's go to page 22. Page 22. Councilman Henry, page 22.
Yeah, I have a question, and I'm sorry if this is something that should have been answered earlier. I'm just noticing in the table of permitted and conditional uses in office residential care facility is permitted. Residential care facility 17 or larger is conditional. And the reason I was struck by that was I had in my head that the residential care facilities were 8 or fewer. Are they 16 or fewer?
Two categories.
Well, I guess the reason I say is I thought there were 3 categories. I thought there was an 8 and fewer, then there was a 9 to 16, and then there was a 17 and up.
Again, this is the language that we received from the law department after the requirement of the judge, but it has to do with the disability,
Right.
you know,
And
and
I remember having this conversation where from 8 and fewer was treated as a single family, but there was no. I had never previously heard anyone imply that up to 16 in occupancy was the equivalent of a single family.
It is my understanding that this is what the judge mandated when the Justice Department sued the city over our categorization of residential treatment facilities, that it was okay to require conditional use for 17 or more, but everything below that had to be treated as residential.
So there's an actual judge's order that effectively says 16 people is the equivalent of a single family.
I'm not sure they say that that's the equivalent of a single family. I'm not sure that's the terminology that they use, but I can get you the exact wording.
Okay, and
Right.
just out of curiosity, did we challenge that or appeal it or anything?
Oh, yes, we did, yes.
And
It was litigated,
And
and there
where-
was a settlement.
I think we should probably defer to your meeting already scheduled with Mr. Naden, because
Yes.
this is his area of expertise.
be most appropriate.
But it does have to do with districts that permit multifamily get treated differently than districts that don't.
Correct.
Okay, all right. And then the other question I had, I guess this is less of a question and more of just a suggested amendment, is even in office residential, I would suggest that fraternity and sorority houses be conditional by ordinance rather than.
I did not.
Is that?
Wait a minute, wait.
repeat that?
I'm sorry. Even in office residential zoning, I would suggest that fraternity and sorority houses be conditional by ordinance rather than conditional by BMZA, if only to save the BMZA.
We have no objection.
Councilman Clark?
Let me just say that I believe there are no office residential properties in my district, although I got to go back and double check in Charles Village. And so I don't have amendments
About
in office residential, but I certainly support what you're saying.
Is it it appears that it is not hard, or maybe I shouldn't say not hard. It feels like over the years it has been relatively easy to rezone residential property that's on the border of commercial property to office residential, because it's not that dramatic of a shift. And that's the reason why I'm bringing this up, is because I can imagine, while I'm not thinking of a particular currently office residential zoned set of properties, I'm just thinking that conceptually I can picture properties that had been residential but then had been rezoned office residential that I would imagine would still be contentious places for a fraternity or sorority house to move.
I mean, Mr. Stephanie, can you just double check in Charles Village, Calvert, St. Paul, Charles, make sure we don't have any, I just don't like to go into other people's territory when I don't even have one, and we've worked with Charles Village, but office residential is,
Yeah, it's just an amendment.
Okay.
yeah, and
All right.
I support
Okay.
his amendments.
It would,
Okay. Anything else on page 22? Anyone else on page 22?
Just for the record, note, there are some minor amendments on the agency's initial report regarding this. I'm not going to reread them unless the council would like those. I mean, should we put them for the insert, or should we do that separately?
So what are they? It's
The planning commission suggested to clarify with an asterisk on neighborhood commercial in office residential that it only applies to uses not already permitted in the zone, because there's some overlap in the permitted uses.
okay.
I think that's the only one regarding office residential.
Okay. Anyone else on page 22? Okay. We'll now go on page 23. Page 23 is office residential zoning district bulk and yard regulations. No? Okay. We are now on page 24. This is 12-4, permitted conditional uses in the TOD district. Yeah, Councilman Henry?
I'm sorry, I meant to ask on page 23, just in terms of how residential care facilities work, are the individual rooms in a residential care facility treated as individual dwelling units?
No.
Okay, so the minimum lot area that refers to the number of square feet per dwelling unit does not mean anything for a residential care facility, other than the minimum for the existence of the facility.
Except for the fact that there could be a building, let's say, that has 5 units in it, and each unit is a residential care facility of sorts.
Oh, yeah, no,
So
that seems unlikely.
That
in
would
terms of
kick in
organization.
that case if it was maybe designed in that way.
Is there any reference in bulk regulations for a minimum square footage for individual bedrooms in
No.
any type of multifamily?
No, that's governed, I understand, by state licensing.
But if we did one across the board for multifamily that was not targeted to licensed facilities by the state, if we just said flatly that any multifamily property had to have a minimum square footage per,
You can't treat, the issue is you can't treat residential care facilities differently than other housing units. I believe the housing code has minimum standards on bedrooms and windows in bedrooms and that sort of thing, and they would apply to all bedrooms regardless.
Gotcha. Okay. All right.
Okay. All right. You done?
I think so. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Okay. So you want to go back to what?
I just want to go back
To, huh?
to the master plan.
Okay.
He said
You
it
ready?
when you came back.
Oh, okay.
You ready?
Yeah.
Yeah. Councilman Kraft?
Yep. I had, when we were talking about the role of the master plan in the, and how that fit in, whether it was advisory or whatever, and wanted to check the charter because there was some language that I remembered from the charter. So in one part, it says that it's for the general purpose of guiding, but in another part, it says that conformity with the plan is required, and that deals with a long section of things. No public, this is Article 7, Section 74D, as in David. No public improvement or enterprise, including, among other things, streets, highways, boulevards, viaducts, bridges, subways, tunnels, or other uses of land for purposes of public transportation, piers, wharves, docks, bulkheads, and buildings or structures thereon, whether public or privately owned or operated. Publicly owned places of recreation, such as playgrounds, squares, or parks, and public buildings, including school buildings, and public utilities, services, or terminals, including gas, water, electricity, sewage, telephone, telegraph, transportation, whether privately or publicly owned or operated, within the scope of the master plan shall be authorized or constructed in Baltimore City unless the location and grade thereof, and in cases of the use of land for purpose of transportation, the width thereof shall be in conformity with the master plan and have been approved, first approved by the commission. So I would say that doesn't mean that
Can you read that last line? Approved?
shall be in conformity with the master plan and have been first approved by the commission. So the number test is, number one is, it has to be in conformity, then there has to be an affirmative finding by the commission that it was in fact in conformity with that, but it is a requirement of conformity. And I just gave it to our council along with a 2012 case out of Baltimore County, requiring conformity to master plan and interpretation of that, and then a 2013 case out of Montgomery County, interpreting what must be consistent rather than conformity. So just
Yeah,
trying
I
to-
think I'm not disagreeing with any of that, and I believe in the master plan there is language that's why I asked you to read the last line about the commission action, because there is language in the adopted 2006 master plan that refers to subsequent actions by the planning commission automatically becoming part of the master plan. So the planning commission's subsequent action is reviewing and adopting the recommendations of this code, and therefore automatically a part of that master plan.
they are. I have to
That is
pull-
our understanding unless our
Okay,
law
I-
department says
yeah.
otherwise.
I need to.
Amend the charter like that.
I
It's
need
not
to-
an amendment to the charter, it's the way the master plan of 2006 was written. It reflects and automatically, for example, there's a 10-year solid waste plan. So in 2006, we were under a given 10-year solid waste plan. When Department of Public Works did a new solid waste plan, I think it was 2 years ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, they did an update to their 10-year plan, and that plan had to go to the Planning Commission and be approved, and as a result of the Planning Commission's approval of the newer 10-year plan, it automatically becomes part of the master plan because of the way the 2006 plan was written, that subsequent actions become a part of that master plan.
So, talking about subsequent actions becoming part of the master plan, and so the sustainability plan
Another example.
is part of the master plan, right?
Yes.
So what happens, and I know there are a number of cases of this, where the sustainability plan, if it's interpreted as it's written, can come into conflict with the master plan. Who decides which prevails?
I would defer to law on that, but we have not, that has not been brought up as an issue, and the Planning Commission has not had to handle that. The action when the commission adopted the sustainability master plan, again, it was noted that that's automatically, I believe that was in '08, so it was after the master plan, that was automatically a part of the city's.
Yeah, I mean, we wrote it into that when we did it. I remember that we intentionally put it in there that it was going to be part of the master plan.
Right,
We
but the
tied it
master
to
plan,
it.
you didn't even need to do that because the master plan already says that it's actions.
Well, I
but
can't remember
either
which way we did it, but
Yes.
we made it that they tied together.
Yes. A
But-
conflict between elements of the master plan, I assume would be up to the commission to interpret.
The commission's empowered by resolution to change the master plan. So if it's something approved by the commission, it becomes part of the plan. Then there are several other mechanisms as well to change the master plan, but that's
So-
the commission's role.
So it would be up to them to interpret it and determine.
Yeah, I think if they,
Okay.
agree that that's the interpretation, they've in essence
Okay, all right.
changed the plan.
Yeah.
Mr. Willis?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I told the vice chair that I would compare the language in those cases that he cited with the language in our master plan and the charter and get back to him on how it works. But I do think the issue that's being raised here is important before adoption of this code to make sure that people understand the relationship and that there may be some things we can do on that.
But then what the committee's recommending, suggesting is that you and the law department sit down and I
Right.
think you have some case.
Right,
laws.
I'll review those cases with the law department.
But
Just to make sure that, I understand, I'm not disagreeing with anything planning's saying, but I just would like to check the cases myself and then
For
get back to
clarity.
you.
And then we can point to the master plan language. As to the basis of this, what I hear, it's initially being brought up about the desire to have a business industrial zone that does not include residential. In the refinement and the development of this, we did explore that, and we would not object to an additional industrial zone being created if that was the council's wishes. We sort of had gone back and forth through a lot of input from community, from property owners, from neighborhoods, and came to this point. But this is a bit of a living document, and if the council feels that it is desirable to have an additional and different industrial zone that is exclusive of residential, we already have 3 industrial zones that do not permit residential. We have I-1, I-2, and the MI. Also, the office industrial campus is extremely limited in its residential as well. So we would be, or OI, office industrial campus, prohibits the industrial, residential altogether. So we have 4 categories that prohibit it. And, we would certainly, if the council desires to have an additional category, that could be a modification, and then map that appropriately. We're not, what I would suggest is if the concern is a master plan goal or objective, and there is a need for this category that prohibits residential, we're not against that. I think that would, again, how it gets mapped and where would be the issue. What we heard through our process that's evolved since 2006 is that these older buildings, in order to work, need to be more permissive on residential. So what I hear is a couple options. One, to modify that permissiveness, whether it's the Philadelphia technique, which ties it to a certain amount of non-residential, that might be the right tool, or create a separate and a different zoning category, IMU without residential, or give it a different name for simplicity, and determine where that should be mapped differently than the ones where it's appropriate to have residential. I think the simplest solution would be to limit the residential, but we would not oppose either approach there.
Okay. Before I go to Ms. Floyd, any of my colleagues want to?
Well, yes, I just wanted to ask a question about what we're talking about. I think you answered it in your last comments, but we're talking about IMU here, right? In other words, we're not really talking about some new I kind of zone. Your comments are directed at what we could do about IMU.
Well, yes, but what I hear from Ms. Floyd is a concern that it's wholly in conflict with the master plan. And if that is a concern of the council,
Right.
there could be another category.
For IMU.
Well, I would
call
say
it something else.
Call it something else in addition to that does not permit residential. What we found in our drafting is that with the I-1 and the OIC, we got to the same place, and we believe that meets the intention of the master plan. But if the council disagrees with that, another solution would be a different category. That does not address your concern about IMU, and I think your concern about residential density
That's my concern.
would better be addressed with the suggestion, that it be limited to some percentage or, some ratio of non-residential uses, and we will work with CPHA and look at the Philadelphia language. That
Okay,
seems
all right.
an appropriate direction.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Floyd, first of all, I just want to thank you for the last work session, bringing that to my attention in regards to the master plan. So go ahead.
Well, thank you for not shooting the messenger. I welcome very much what Mr. Willis is going to look into. I just wanted to sort of put on the record that there always seems to be an elephant in the room, and for me, that elephant is the annotated code of Maryland, once again. It's my understanding, and as a layperson who's trying to study this, that the policy document is to be adopted by the city council, so that it's not just the planning commission, but it also comes to the city council, which is what you did in November of 2006. So that has happened. And that pursuant to that, there is then a comprehensive rezoning process, a zoning map process, and which is supposed to implement the master plan. One of the things that I'm aware of right now is that we are at the end of our 10-year cycle required by the state to review and amend the master plan. So literally, it is now the summer of 2015, or almost. And we should be right now doing that. So hearing that something has evolved and that we're making policy through this document, it's always kind of worried me, but I haven't quite understood why. We're here arguing policy and differences between one and the other. It appears that that is part of the problem here, that the master plan does need review, it does need updating, it does need amending. And we're seeing that, I think, here. But we're also required to do that by the state. So that's, again, I say the annotated code of Maryland has certain, and it also speaks to consistency, although I know Mr. Willis is going to be much better than I could ever be at understanding what those requirements are. But it does speak to consistency, that the annotated code does do that. So I welcome the exploration. I hope that this is, all looked into. Thank you.
Thank you. Duly noted. So the committee's going to sit back. We'll wait for the attorneys to get back to us. Okay. We are now on page.
Chairman, may I say something?
Yeah, I don't want to keep dwelling on this.
All right, I don't either, but I want the right to come back to it because it's becoming the elephant in the room, well, for the moment. And we have a policy of not going backwards, but we're going to have to dwell on this at some point and get it straightened out. And I don't care what the master plan says, frankly. I care about residential density.
Yeah. To answer your question,
I mean, it
Councilwoman,
says to play, to
to answer your question, when it comes, we have in the past, if there's issues that have to be addressed or questioned from any agency, we do go back.
okay. And so if we can just have this as a category, IMU.
We will.
Oh, and I know that.
Page 24.
I know that.
Anyone have any amendments on page 24?
Again, there were a number of amendments from the Planning Commission, and I think Kara and her staff have them, so I'm not going to go over each one. It was some clarity in the TOD, and I believe there was some correction of errors in one of the tables, and that sort of thing.
I don't have any TODs because
We don't.
I don't have any TODs.
I mean, for the committee.
Do you want me to read them?
We don't have anything in front of us, so we know
Oh,
what's
okay.
happening here.
I'm just going off of the agency report.
Okay.
I think these comments are already on the record, and I can work with Paul to make sure they get inserted in the right place. They're just off of this.
on the book?
Some of them just say table, so.
Yeah, Councilman Kraft?
And I don't have it in front of me, but banquet halls as permitted uses,
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
banquet halls as permitted uses. I think we weren't going to have banquet halls as permitted uses anywhere.
I did not do amendments for these. I don't have any TODs.
I think that,
Didn't have time.
I think that was, I mean, we're not doing banquet halls as permitted anywhere.
Your choice. That's fine. That's your prerogative.
Yeah, it's just conditional by ordinance.
Okay. And just to note, for the council and the audience, the way the TOD 1 and 3, well, let's put it this way. TOD 1 and 2 are the lower density, so they're physically smaller. 3 and 4 are the taller areas, the higher densities like your Penn Station. And the difference between 1 and 2 is 2 is more commercial, where you have the transit in a very commercial area. 1 is much more residential. An example is along Edmondson Avenue, which is where the red line's scheduled to go, but it's primarily residential. And the same thing with 3 and 4. So
Right.
that's just so you understand the logic of the 4 zones.
Right, and also, on live entertainment, that's another issue with regard to automatically having a permitted use on live entertainment. I think we need to look at that also in terms of a conditional use. I don't know
Again,
whether,
the live entertainment in the TOD more intense zones, the 2 and the 4, was definitely something that was discussed and desired by many.
nobody's saying
again,
it's not desired. All we're saying is it's not going to just be automatically permitted. I mean, wherever we're putting live entertainment, question is whether it would be conditional to the board or conditional to ordinance, and I think we could talk about that. But clearly, that has to be a conditional use in terms of live entertainment.
And again, in this code, this is when it's entertainment live, that is the standalone. We kept what the council did for the existing code for as part of the restaurants or taverns as being conditional. So this would be the standalone.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
So you could break it down differently if you wanted. That's all I'm saying.
Right, and this lodge and social club, these lodges and social clubs are essentially the same as the banquet halls. I mean, they end up just being places to rent out the halls, and really, there aren't many of these.
I think
They should be
I'm not sure if
automatically permitted use.
I'm not sure if Paul's able to capture all this, but we should probably note for the record whether you're suggesting conditional by ordinance or conditional.
Well, I'm
to
just
the
saying
board.
conditional right now. I'm saying conditional. We can talk about whether it's
And
an
then
ordinance
note
or
later.
The only
Okay.
one is condition ordinance for sure is the banquet hall.
Okay, banquet hall CO.
But live
And-
entertainment and lodge or social club, I would recommend that they be conditional, and we discuss whether they be by board or ordinance.
Councilman Henry?
Thank you. Mine's just very brief. I just want to reassure myself that transit-oriented development effectively refers to rail transit. Because and the reason I say that, the reason I'm asking is that if buses count as transit, then we could be having TOD zoning all over the city, and we don't. So I've been working under the assumption that when the code is referring to transit-oriented development, they're referring to light rail, metro,
Yes.
the still possible red line.
Right,
that kind of thing.
as mapped, that was the mapping, and I believe, but I'm not sure that, I have to go back to the definition to double check it in definition. It was, for the record, a subject of much debate. And one example that I'm sure you're familiar with is the intersection, for example, of 33rd and St. Paul. And
Wow, that's exactly the one I was envisioning, yes.
and a lot of people thought, hold up.
Relax.
It's not zone TOD, but there were people that came to us and said, that really should be, that is a transit hub. It's an intersection of 3 bus lines. It is an active place. It should be a transit hub. But in the end, we took the more conservative approach and just went with the traditional approach, which is, the trains and light rail and subway and that sort of thing. I think this is something that will come back and be looked at in the future, because what we're seeing is in other cities is a broader thinking about transit, because people, whether it's, bike sharing and other things, but we're not there yet. And maybe in 5 years we'll be in a different place.
I raised it largely because if you work from the presumption that transit-oriented development follows rail transit, then, just speaking very parochially, the 4th District probably doesn't have to concern itself with transit-oriented development for as long as the yellow line remains mostly imaginary. But if we get to the point where, in recognition of the fact that there will not be the money to continue to build additional rail lines, and we move into something along the lines of bus rapid transit or any of the,
You start to get a blurring.
you start to get that blurring, but that would have to be then its own conversation to have at that point.
Right, and it would
Okay.
be subject to a map amendment that could only be approved by this council. So I'm not,
Yeah.
couldn't happen overnight.
Okay.
Well,
Thank you.
okay, just to before I go to Councilwoman Clark, if you look at the definition of TODs, there is no restriction on what type of transit it is. So, for example, and I'll use my district. We have an area where we could have bus lines and the water taxi without the red line, but we could have water taxi stops, we could have bus lines, we could have them, and parking for
Bike share.
and bike share all coming together. And I think that, you know, we may come and say we would like to have this rezoned as TOD, and again, you know, I don't think that any of us should wed ourselves to viewing to viewing TOD as strictly train or mass transit or red line, because it gives a lot of tools. And not only that, there are economic development funds available for TOD that aren't available through other sources. And if you look at some key places, you know, you may well want to say, maybe we want to put TOD here because we have the intersection of multiple bus lines, because we have, you know, bike share, because we have the, wait a minute, it's all being, because we have the shuttle, because we have whatever, but there are, because that's the goal of the whole thing, of getting people, moving people rather than moving cars. And that's
We agree with Councilman Kraft 100%, and that's an unusual situation, just to note. But and
Okay. She's next.
and that's why the definition just uses the word transit, but the mapping is the more conservative mapping. We think that's the right way to move forward today, so that the council can make map amendments in the future based on new thinking for, you know, or new changes or technology in transit, using the broader word.
Councilwoman Clark and then Councilwoman Spector.
I just, since I don't have, excuse me, a TOD and I don't want one, ever, I would like to just say, however, to those who do have them and think they're so cool, my memory of TODs and the like is right in front of you. Yeah, right. My concept of TODs and things like that is that if you're going to invest a gazillion dollars in equipment and tracking and stuff, then you should develop around that magnet commercial enterprises that generate. In other words, you should get something out of it besides a ride to work. You should get out of it hubs of increased commercial activity. I don't want that.
Commercial and residential.
Well, or whatever. That's not why my question or my statement. Lodges have been redefined to include adult, I use that word advisedly,
Adult fraternities.
fraternities and sororities, so that we can be more restrictive. Oh, so that we can make a distinction between Animal House and adult people doing good work. And I don't want to see lodges and taverns having any more restrictions than they do now under the commercial definitions and uses. And I'm looking for what we've done, what I did, and I can't find it, but I just wanted to state what it is in TODs. Thank you.
I guess I'm,
Capital Inspector?
I guess I'm a little fuzzy about a TOD, whether it's transit-oriented or because it's good intersection for public transportation, not necessarily light rail. I have now a possibility of 300 families moving to my district from New York. They don't own cars, they never needed cars, they're coming to this area because they don't need cars. They stay together in their daily work life and residential life, but they do want to be on a bus line. They want public transportation, not necessarily light rail. From what you're describing, that could be classified as a TOD. That area that they've picked to
Based on the
straddle both
definition of TOD, we left it open with the word transit. So if there were a change in an area or a need to map it for that, yes, it could be.
Thinking, what if they made that a bike hub where you could like zip bike rather than
Well, I
zip
guess
car?
I would first ask, what are you trying to solve in making the zoning change? Is it to increase the uses? I mean, it may be already a commercially zoned area, which would be fairly permissive on the uses that this group would want to see there.
Well, there's no chance that where they are there would be heavy metal light rail, but there would be possibly continuum of bus transportation or bike, renting bikes, not renting cars. Yeah,
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 like
that
a
kind of thing.
gangster.
Or even, it might even be like a taxi cab service a hub could be where, because they only need transportation when they need it. They don't need it for their 24/7
Well,
life.
you don't need TOD zoning to have the transportation. I think I would flip the question around and say, what from a land use perspective would you be trying to achieve? Is it the higher density residential? Is it the
Higher density residential.
commercial? Because we also have higher density residential zones as well, which may be a more appropriate zone. I mean, without knowing the geography off the top of my head. But we could discuss the appropriate zone for that specific geography. But this would not prohibit a bus intersection from being zoned TOD. But we did not make any of those recommendations in these maps.
But I also envision down the road in these pockets, an area where they would make it a bike zone, where people either can rent a bike or at least use bikes as their transportation rather than buses, light rail, or trains or cars. I think that's, it's going to be an urban kind of mode of moving people. On the, if I can, on the idea of the not the music hall, what was it? We were just talking, it just went right out of my head.
The adult fraternities?
The
Or-
halls that we have, we're afraid where they're making,
Banquet halls? Banquet halls?
banquet halls. I couldn't think of it. Banquet halls. Sometimes they mask them as other kinds of businesses. And that is what has been a real challenge to us as council people. Really, it is sometimes a venue for these promoters that are using it because it can hold up to 250 people. Has nothing to do with a banquet. It's really an event promotion.
Right. I think the council discussed this in depth when we talked about the definition, and I don't have those notes in front of me, but I think all added some language to the definition
what I wanted
of
to make
banquet hall
sure.
to address those concerns.
I think we're all on the same page.
No matter what it is, it does have to come to the council for permission to have a banquet hall. But
Well,
if,
we had recommended it be permitted in certain zones. Of course, that's your prerogative, but I think the first thing is really to agree on the definition.
that's
And,
what I
and
wanted.
I know this committee did have some language, so maybe that, just go back to that.
Want to be on the same page on. Because I can tell you that these facilities are sought after by these one-time-a-year promoters, and before you know it, you have really a misuse of a facility.
Yes, I recall that discussion.
All right. Okay, thank you. That was page 24. Okay, 25, you got to get back to us on the,
Yeah.
okay. So now we are on page 26. This is page 26, 12-403. It's TOD District's Park and Yard Regulations. Any of my colleagues have any amendments or discussion on page 26?
No.
Okay. Now we are on page 27, and Councilwoman Clark, you have some amendments? Yes. Council Kraft?
Right, on the, on TOD 3 and TOD 4 on page 26, on the maximum heights of 100 feet permitted by conditional use, that's, as it's written right now, that's a board conditional use, right? Yes. Okay. Can we have a discussion, and we don't need to have it right now, but because I don't have a clear fix in my mind of where these TOD 3s and TOD 4s exactly may be, but depending on where they are. I'm picturing TODs in Montgomery County, where they have built office hotels on top of the stations and been able to, and then build out from there. And you can't build what you need to build and generate the money you need to generate at 100 feet. Right. I mean, you really need to build at 300 or 400. And, you know, so I don't know whether that would be in a TOD 3 or a TOD 4 or what, or how we would do it, whether we would do it for a map or something like that. But I don't think that, where I'm going with this is, I think that maximum limit may need to be higher in some situation.
We don't disagree, and that's why we put the conditional use, because we found ourselves in, hearing from a lot of people that conceptually they were okay, but felt there should be some process to go higher. And, one example was Penn Station, where many of the community groups and others said, we want it sky high. We want that to be, filled with activity and everything going on there and be a real hub like many other cities. But, in other places, folks were torn as to, just putting unlimited in a code, no height limit. So this was the compromise that we start with. Developers wanted some predictability, that you get a certain amount, like you said, because you need that, and some process to get additional.
Right.
So that's how we got to these numbers.
Yeah, and like, it's not my district, so I can't like advocate.
I
but
think
I
you
mean,
do
but Penn
have
Station,
some. I think you do have some 3 and 4 in your district.
And I think Penn Station is a good example of a place that could be that sort of hub.
Right.
Because where it's located and the type of development that is spreading out from there already would lend itself to that with the educational facilities, the North Avenue, all of that. So I think that we should look at that.
Yeah, I think the Canton Crossing was an example where there's TOD. I think we recommended TOD 4, and again, that site, much of it has permission already to go higher than 100 feet.
No, I told them they could go 500 there if they wanted to.
No, it's less than that, but but again,
Boston and Clinton.
the communities wanted some process to talk about the taller buildings, and that's where we got to that.
What is Cherry Hill and Westport?
Cherry Hill and Westport is I
that-
believe that they are the TOD. Cherry Hill is TOD 2, and Westport, I believe, is the taller one, the TOD 4, because again, that has an approved plan for a much taller development.
Protocol. Okay, all right. Thank you.
I
Are
think
you
you're
done?
doing the wrong.
Are you finished?
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't agree with you.
Okay, we are now on page 27, Councilwoman Clark. You have amendments on page 27?
I also have, would like to introduce Chris.
Well, let's go through the amendments and then we'll bring in the,
First of all, there's a new one that I'd like to put before the council on this page, which is all right, what you have is a chart that is hand-done, pardon me for my, well, it's grassrootsy. The top chart, I've broken E1, which is primary schools, and away from E2, which is colleges.
okay.
And come up, and there are different regulations for each, and I would like to add under E1, which is primaries, that it's been proposed and suggested to change the minimum lot area to 1 acre. I do have a site in my district, which I've actually proposed it for EC1 zoning, and we want it to be a school, but it lacks 2 acres. But if we put 1, then that would fit in. The rest of these changes to E1, you can see, maximum building height goes to down to 35 feet. These are elementary schools that are at least now 1 acre or bigger. The front perimeter yard setback would go from 10 feet to 40 feet. The corner side perimeter yard from 10 feet to 20 feet setback. The rear yard would not have a setback requirement unless it abuts a residential district, which many of them do. Then it would be 40 feet is the change from 15. But most important of all, in many respects, is that we want a maximum floor area ratio, FAR, of 0.8. And then you can see that the colleges, E2, the maximum building height would actually vary. If the setback is less than 40 feet from the front perimeter yard, or as it abuts a residential district, or rear perimeter yard, then the height would be reduced to 45 feet. The front perimeter yard would go to 20 feet requirement minimum setback. The corner side perimeter yard would go from 10 to 20 feet required setback. And those are the changes. And my colleague Sharon Green Middleton and I worked with the Roland Park Civic League, and I might say worked hard, because there were all kinds of people on that committee that were participating to hammer out this proposal.
Okay, So does any of my colleagues have a question? Councilman Henry?
Sorry. Okay, just, I want to clarify again. So E1 is just secondary institutions and down, and E2 is,
Grade schools.
yeah, so all college and university educational campus only is E2.
Yes.
Yes, that's how it is drafted.
Okay, good. All
The,
right.
the only difference here, if I'm understanding Councilman Clark's amendments, is we created one table and
Yeah.
treated them the same on the tables, and so she's duplicating the table and on
I created
and revising the bulk so that the bulk changes as well as the use changes.
Gotcha.
Right now, it's just use changes.
And the reason I just wanted to be clear is I do have what I guess is EC2 in my district. I thought it was EC1, but if all college and university is
They're
two,
two, like
gotcha.
they're bigger than the.
Right.
Right, and
So
the distinction is really the more permissive in some of the uses.
then my question is, I was just asking if you could go through in the E2 maximum building height amendment. I'm having trouble following the language of the proposed amendment here.
If you would turn your page to the page behind it, at the bottom of your page, it's written out,
So it's actually
I mean, in other words,
Unless setback less than 40 feet on front perimeter yard or abutting residential district at corner side perimeter for rear perimeter yard, then 45. Yeah, so it,
so if you.
it reads the same.
You've got to come
so
down.
instead of just one education table, it's two.
If you want, if you want to come out beyond the setbacks,
Okay, so if,
better be shorter because we don't want you overshadowing the surrounding residential.
so just, okay, so if I'm reading this right, then as long as you're more than 45, here's why I'm asking. I'm asking because there is a chunk of Loyola's campus that physically juts out into the Radnor-Winston neighborhood, where it is literally a residential a residential setback away from an adjacent house. And I'm trying to be sensitive to the fact that we would not want the college or university to be able to build a 65-foot building right there next to the house. What I just want to be clear on is if they are deeper into their campus trying to build something 65 feet high, this doesn't address that.
True.
Okay, and the reason I was having a little trouble, and perhaps Mr. Willis can help me later on, I don't want to take up too much more of the committee's time, is the lack of commas with the or abutting residential district kind of made it feel like if it's abutting a residential district, that triggers it. But abutting the residential district
By
could,
this much, by these numbers.
could it was if it's all one lot, which a lot of the campuses are, then even if this corner of it is abutting a residential district right here, but they want to build over here,
Oh, there are setbacks.
and that was the part where you refer to the setbacks at the beginning and at the end, but in the middle you just have this or abutting residential district at corner side perimeter, which was a little broader than I was.
I got you.
Comfortable
I
with.
see what you're saying,
Yeah,
and I
so
think
that's-
we can fix that.
Yeah, I get your intent. I get your intent. I just don't want to accidentally I don't want to accidentally say that anywhere in the entire campus, just because one corner of it abuts a residential district,
No.
this is
It's-
happening.
It's governed
Yeah,
by,
that's it.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
governed by, if you're meeting the setbacks, the revised setbacks,
Okay.
then you are out of that 45-foot requirement because you've set back.
Okay.
Because if you're back away from residential, then your height is less overshadowing and proposing.
Okay.
So it's a combination of setbacks that kick you in or out of the change.
In that case, I am, that was my only concern about the E2 amendment. I would ask, just as a question of information, I don't have any E1 in my district, but I'm just curious as to why you would alter the building height and not have the abutting residential district qualifier for that. So because the way I'm reading it, you're saying flatly that they just can't build anything above 35 feet anywhere on the campus, no matter how far that building is from residential, and whether there would be anyone's sight lines, affected or not.
I really need Ms. McSherry
Okay.
to
Sure.
pick
Well,
up
we
here. She
Councilman Kraft,
negotiate.
After the council's done, then we're going to bring them.
Oh, okay.
Yep. My question is to Councilwoman Clark.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, Councilwoman. Before she introduces you, I'm looking at the EC1, okay? So when these changes in the height and the yard perimeters and all of those, one of the things that these do, and I don't know whether this is the intention of it, these limit the size of these schools in the number of students that they can have.
In what way?
Because if you can only build
So tall.
in certain footprint
Well, yeah.
or one city block, 2 acres or one city block, it's more likely, I'm looking at EC1.
I know, and I'm just going to amend it to 1.
Okay,
Acre.
but one, so let's say it's one city block, you could have a really small city block, and I have some schools that are on a one city block. And if you use all these, the setbacks, perimeters, and everything else, and you limit the height to 35 feet, we could end up with a school that could only hold a couple hundred kids.
Yeah, if I could explain briefly
Well, let me
Okay,
let
go
me
ahead.
finish. My other thing is, in doing this, have you had an opportunity to discuss this with the school system
School system?
in
or-
terms of the school construction plan over the next 10
Well,
years?
let me explain.
And how this might.
Okay, so just to
I'm not
remind the
finished.
council. Okay. Got it, I'm sorry.
And Ms. McSherry is next.
So my question is to Councilwoman Clark is just, I don't,
Go ahead.
because I have some schools that are in year 2. I have a couple schools that are pre-year 1, and then I have some schools that are in year 2, okay? So that's my question, is just how they would impact.
Point of information. What? I'm just teasing. Go ahead, because you're gonna. I was gonna say the same thing that Lori will say if you go to her next.
I'm finished.
Laura, you want to respond?
Just to answer Councilman Kraft, schools were treated, public schools were treated, they are permitted in the high-density residential. The educational campus zones, both school and university, is limited to those on a campus. So it is not mapped on the general schools that are integrated into residential areas, our typical public schools, which are much smaller. It is limited to in our mapping. Now, you could make some mapping changes. It's not limited by code. It was limited by our mapping principles to the larger multi-acre school campuses. Emphasize campus as opposed to just school.
Well, how do you distinguish between, so this would be distinguishing between a private school or a parochial school and a public school?
It doesn't by code, but, fortunately or unfortunately, most of our public schools are not really on campuses. They do not have large areas of land. And so
I'm confused.
by mapping, we did not map this category to any public schools.
Well, what I'm confused about is if we create this EC1, which is for elementary and high schools, right?
Campuses.
Whatever. Campus. Give me an example of one. Tell me
Roland
one.
Park Country School, Gilman, Friends.
That's what I just said. A private.
It's not limited by code. It was only done by mapping policy. That's all.
Okay.
Private schools in my district are zoned, oh, I'm sorry.
I understand that. Okay. But you just can't write the code and say Friends, Gilman, Bryn Mawr.
And we did not.
Okay. So if St. Casimir's wanted to buy the land behind them and expand their school, would they be an EC1? Would they
No.
be subject to this?
No, only the council could apply the EC1 mapping zone. The reason for this is in our work and review and experience is right now, in our code, schools are permitted absolutely any residential zone, no review, no anything. They can build whatever they want. They're permitted. The regulations around the schools are really in the residential zones, really don't suit either the schools or the residential zones particularly, because they have height limits such as 35 feet or the FAR limits. They're not really reflective of the campuses, nor are they necessarily reflective of the zone around them, because as being governed by FAR, they're large lots, they could build huge things today. And so through our process, we recognize that it's very important to accommodate these major institutions, both hospital and educational, that are very invested. They have multiple buildings on large campuses, and right now they're living under a residential zone that really doesn't match their purpose. So that was the reason to create the educational zone in the first place. We also left schools as permitted in high-density residential. In the lower density residential, we moved schools to conditional use, again, because of the impact of these larger schools.
Well, let me give another example then. I mean, who is determining who's doing EC1? Are you guys doing that, or?
We made mapping recommendations based on those mapping principles, and it's obviously up to the council. There are no EC in your district, I can tell you.
I know that. I'm just thinking about how they get applied and what the standards are, and if somebody came in and said, this should be an EC zone, why isn't it an EC zone? If John Rura has a huge campus, it's like the equivalent of 2 square blocks because it sits in the middle of Greektown, and all of a sudden, they've got a building here and they've got a building there and they've got 6 temporary buildings and they're building a huge field and all that, and somebody says, wait a minute, we've got this EC1 standard here and we want them to abide by these setbacks and we want them to abide by these heights. Why should this school over here be required to abide by it and they not be required to abide by it?
Well, the heights, they have height limits and they have standards in their base residential zone. And the height limits and standards are very similar to those of the EC1. So they are abiding by it.
Then why, if they are abiding by it, then why do we have to create the zone?
The zone was created to give the use flexibility for these institutions that have multiple uses going on their campuses.
I might be able to
Okay.
help with this, Councilman
If the
Kraft.
council sees fit to just, make schools permitted with no review on these campuses, that's another option. And that's how it is today.
Mr. Chairman.
Councilwoman Clark, so then we can,
Yes, I think Ms. McSherry is in a good position where she lives and serves as president and Lord knows I've sat in more meeting rooms of private high schools and schools in the last year in her good company than I had for the previous life that I've lived. There is a real need for this kind of control of development where you have these large Bryn Mawrs, Gilmans, et cetera. They're huge. And she can explain it better than I can, so that you can see why it is. I don't agree with all the provisions of ECs. As you can see, there are suggested amendments. Let me say that they're coming from me and from Councilwoman Middleton. Ms. McSherry.
Thank you. I'm Christine McSherry. I'm the president of the Roland Park Civic League, although today I'm speaking for the greater Roland Park area, including North Roland Park and Winehurst Improvement Association, Tuxedo Park, Keswick, Evergreen. The whole area has worked together on coming up with these amendments. Councilman Kraft, to answer your question, I'll give you a little bit of history. Right now, schools are residentially zoned. R1, they can build right up to the property line just like a residence, 10-foot setbacks on most property lines. They don't have any restrictions or flexibility that would suit their particular purpose as a school. So we've had a lot of problems in the community with schools building very large buildings very close to property lines, which is not appropriate when you're right next to a residential community. So the EC designation, we thought was a very good idea to create a separate zoning designation for these independent schools that have very large campuses. They should be treated differently than, frankly, the public schools in the city or even the parochial schools throughout the city. Most of those schools don't have large campuses, so these restrictions wouldn't make sense for them. And I understand Lori's point about the mapping, but I also think that the zoning code doesn't apply to public schools, does it, Lori?
Yes, it does.
Oh, it does? Okay, I thought they could do more or less what public schools wanted on their public school land. So we supported the idea of the separate EC designation to treat the schools separately. However, when the regs came out, they were way more generous on the bulk and yard regulations than we expected. We thought that the underlying regulations should be more restrictive. Remember that if a school is in an EC zone and they want to do something that's different than the bulk and yard regulations, they can file a campus master plan, and their campus master plan could include anything that the city council approves. They aren't limited anymore once they get an approved campus master plan by these bulk and yard regulations. And the reason that the community likes that idea so much is that then we get to have a little conversation with them about what they're going to build. We get to sit down in a room with them and our council people and say to them, okay, we understand why you want to build a 65-foot tall building, but can you please put it further away from the boundary so you're not overshadowing our homes? Or we understand why you want to exceed the floor area ratio, and we can work with you on that, but we have to have some say in where the buildings go or how tall they are or what they look like. And so that's the primary purpose of the EC zone, is so that the schools and the communities will work together in developing those campus master plans so that it will no longer be an adversarial situation, but rather a situation where we're all sitting down and working together on coming up with development plans for the schools that are appropriate. And that's frankly what's done in most of the other jurisdictions in the state. One of the fellows who worked on this with us is Jim Detterman, who's from the Winehurst Improvement Association. He couldn't be here today, but he is an architect, and he represents schools all over the state. And he said Baltimore City is probably the only jurisdiction left in the state where the schools don't have to work with the communities when they want to develop large campuses like these. So the reason that we're asking for these amendments is that right now, the 65-foot building height that's in the proposed legislation would be entirely inappropriate next door to a two-story house. And all of these schools that are in the EC1 are in residential neighborhoods, surrounded by 2 and maybe 3-story houses. And that's why all of the amendments that the councilwomen proposed are the exact same bulk and yard regulations that the surrounding residential neighborhoods have. So if they want to build something that's bigger and out of proportion to the neighborhood, we just want them to have to come back and sit down with us and talk about it. And that's basically why we think all of these are appropriate amendments, because then they just match up with the R1 bulk and yard regulations. And if you look at the schools that this will apply to, they are all surrounded by R1. Some are R1B, some are R1C, some are R1D, but none of these amendments proposed by Councilwoman Clark and Councilwoman Middleton are more restrictive than what surrounds the schools. So they're the exact same restrictions as the R1 neighborhoods surrounding the schools. And again, if the schools want to exceed them, they just have to come back to the council and get a campus master plan.
I just want to, Laura, I just want to piggyback on what Councilman Kraft, I mean, in my old district, I mean, when we had like Cardinal Gibbons was a campus. Same way with Mount St. Joe, which is still there, they're a campus. That's completely different. You're talking apples and oranges. You have Mount St. Joe that's in Irvington, they have a campus style. But then if you go into the city, I have like St. Mary's Star of the Sea School, which is in the neighborhood. It's a community school, right. Same way with Our Lady Good Counsel, Holy Cross. So there's two different.
Right. Mount St. Joe would be a campus similar to this. Right. And I believe we mapped it that way. Cardinal Gibbons, of course, was already closed, and yes. So that was changed.
Okay.
St. Joe's an EC1. St. Joe's an EC1. I just looked at
St. Joe's, yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, it's EC1.
That's Helen's district. That's Helen's district.
Okay, so.
Go ahead. Councilwoman Clark?
Yeah, it makes sense to me, and I hope that the council will approve it when we come to this, when we come back through. We'll approve these amendments. A lot of people worked on them, and they do reflect the surrounding communities. I might add that I have amendments to the text. What happens is, if you're one of these ECs on the map, then these are your base regulations, bulk and yard setback and the like. You, as Ms. McSherry has said, you want something bigger, better, closer, uglier. You've got to come into the council with a master plan that includes that bigger, better, uglier, and get approval of that master plan. And then you can go off into the sunset forevermore. Now, I do have an amendment that would say, well, no, you can't exactly go off into the sunset forevermore, but that's way down the road, which is, I would still bring them back for major changes, like a PUD. So, so I hope that, I mean, I'm sorry, Councilwoman Middleton's not here. She has been very diligent.
That's why
yes,
she called me.
She's always very, very diligent, and I remember when she presented these, and we would like your support.
Is there someone else you want to respond to that?
Just, for the committee's concern, we did go on record with some concerns with Councilman Clark's amendments in the text, and so you really need to look at this table amendments in the context with the text. We're okay philosophically that the idea of the restrictive and we believe they were plenty restrictive, but we respect the community disagreed with that approach. But I think you do need to, if you go with this approach, two things. You need to carefully look back at the text and make sure we're not putting ourselves in an unsolvable box on the process for doing this master plan. And second, I am not sure that any of the institutions that this would impact have had any input or notice of these amendments.
If I may may I respond?
Could I just answer that real quick? I did try for months to organize a meeting with all the schools and all of the interested parties. Never could get all the schools together on a single date, and then they're all being represented by Al Berry. So he said he would try after the holidays were over to find a date that the schools were all available, and then I would round up all the community people, and that just never happened. He never found a date that they could all meet with us, but we did try very hard.
I would just like to say that I think these restrictions, bulk yard and regulations are absolutely essential. And if there are issues with my text, I'd be very glad to work with the planning staff and the Roland Park Civic League group to see whether, we can make that better, given these setback yard regulations and bulk regulations. I think these are crucial.
Councilwoman Spector, you want to use the microphone?
I would be very happy to sit in on.
Why is-
Oh, good, yes.
I'd be very happy to sit in on those meetings, and I think that, I do agree, there was every attempt to try to meet
Oh, yeah.
with the schools, and winter's over and weather's good now, so I think that we ought to, and I'd love to sit in on that. There's a lot, other than just the height, there are other issues that need to be ironed out for a copacetic environment with the schools. And I remember vividly the light situation at Loyola many years ago. And if we get on the same page, we can work it out. But if you don't meet, you're not gonna be able to get there. So I would appreciate planning, setting that up. Maybe that's the way it should happen. Maybe planning could help us set it up.
Is there someone else there that wants to talk?
Well, Al Cop is here. Do you want to say, did you?
No, I think.
You've been here, so if you got,
Did very well.
okay.
Thank you.
All right.
I think Joan.
Ms. Floyd, you responding to this?
On the chart, mostly, for EC1. And I do want to thank the councilwoman for the reduction, the requested reduction in acreage for the EC1 down to 1 acre. That's something we need. I'm hoping that we're going to be able to be, well, on behalf of the Remington Neighborhood Alliance now, which is the group of which I'm the president, I do hope that we are going to be the exception to the rule that all the EC1s are surrounded by R1, because we're not. But what I'm going to do is take all these requested amendments for the bulk regulations and go back and work with them and figure out what's the school that we can design that will fit these regulations, and I'll report back to the councilwoman on that. I would like a clarification so that I know what I'm going back with to the neighborhood. What is a front perimeter yard as opposed to a front yard? That's one question I have.
I didn't hear you. I'm
Can
sorry.
you repeat that question?
There's front.
You're too
there's-
close to the microphone.
I
Can you-
can't see my paper. There's front perimeter yard, and then there's front yard. And I honestly don't know the difference. I'd like to know the difference.
Laurie?
The front yard was when it was on a major street, as opposed to often these campuses have, irregular perimeters that may be facing the woods or other things.
Right.
But the front yard is on the street.
Okay.
But could that be synonymous to campus?
Councilman Spector, I can't hear you. Can you speak up just a little
I'm
louder?
so sorry. Could that be synonymous to campus? Because that's what we're talking about.
I think that's only used there for the campus. Mhm.
Okay.
And then I guess, okay, are these defined, do we have these definitions in the draft code already? Can we have a reference for that? I'll just use that. I was searching for one just now, I didn't see it, but I'm sure it's in there somewhere.
There's no definition of all this.
You do? No. You got a front lot line.
I have no idea what it means. I just know that.
No, we can
want
add that.
more.
Wait a minute.
We can just add the front perimeter yard, since that's unique to this, and once we've worked with the campus groups.
Is corner side perimeter yard also, is that defined?
Right,
or-
that would be the same thing. We'd have to add that.
Okay? All right. I'm ready. Okay. Is this the? Okay. All right, Al, we're ready to recess. Our next work session on City Council Bill 12-0152, transform Baltimore zoning, will be announced at a later time. I want to thank everyone for attending the committee.
There's no date, Mary
I mean,
Beth.
work session. Please check the area around you, see to make sure that you have everything that you brought with you. Thank you.